On the morning of October 12, 1836, Sheriff Thomas Hartwell climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the third floor of the Whitmore farmhouse in Millbrook County, North Carolina. What he discovered in that dusty attic would become the most horrifying case of child abuse ever documented in the American South. Behind a false wall constructed of rough pine boards, 31 children were found locked in wooden cages, some no bigger than dog kennels. The youngest was barely 3 years old. The oldest was 16. Each cage bore a small metal plate with a number, a date of arrival, and a single word that would haunt investigators for decades: property. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For 12 years, Samuel and Margaret Whitmore had operated what they called the Millbrook Children's Refuge, advertising themselves as a Christian charity that provided homes for orphaned and abandoned children across the Carolinas. Wealthy families and church congregations from as far north as Virginia had donated thousands of dollars to support their holy mission of rescuing innocent souls from poverty and neglect. Local officials praised the Whitmores as pillars of the community, devoted servants of God who had dedicated their lives to caring for society's most vulnerable members. The truth that emerged during the investigation was so disturbing that the state of North Carolina sealed all records related to the case for 50 years. The local newspaper refused to publish the full details, stating only that a terrible crime had been discovered and justice would be served. This was not simply a case of neglect or even ordinary cruelty. This was the systematic imprisonment, abuse, and trafficking of children under the protection of Christian charity and community respect. The investigation revealed that the 31 children found in the Whitmore attic represented only a fraction of the young lives that had passed through their operation over the years. Church records and donation ledgers suggested that more than 200 children had been placed in the Whitmore's care since 1824. When authorities attempted to locate these missing children, they discovered a network of deception so elaborate and systematic that it challenged everything the community thought it knew about the family they had trusted with their most precious donations. To understand how 31 innocent children came to be caged like animals in a North Carolina farmhouse, we must return to the spring of 1824, when Samuel Whitmore first arrived in Millbrook County with his wife Margaret and a vision that would transform their quiet rural community into the center of unimaginable horror. Samuel Whitmore was 42 years old when he purchased the abandoned Thornfield plantation on the outskirts of Millbrook in March of 1824. The previous owners had fled the property during the economic panic of 1819, leaving behind a sprawling two-story farmhouse, several outbuildings, and nearly 400 acres of fertile tobacco land. Local residents were initially suspicious of the newcomer who paid cash for such an expensive property, but Samuel quickly won their trust through his apparent devotion to Christian service and his compelling personal story. Samuel claimed to be a widower from Charleston whose first wife had died in childbirth, taking their unborn child with her. This tragedy, he explained to anyone who would listen, had called him to dedicate his life to caring for children who had no one else to love them. His second wife, Margaret, was a soft-spoken woman of 35 who seemed genuinely devoted to the mission of helping orphan children. She spoke frequently about her own childhood in a Charleston orphanage and her determination to provide better care for children facing similar circumstances. The couple's credentials appeared legitimate and impressive. Samuel presented letters of recommendation from prominent Charleston ministers who praised his charitable work with street children and his substantial financial contributions to various orphanages. Margaret had certificates from the Charleston Female Seminary indicating her training in child care and basic education. Most convincingly, they arrived in Millbrook with 7 children already in their care, ranging in age from 5 to 14, all of whom appeared healthy, well-dressed, and genuinely fond of their guardians. The Millbrook Children's Refuge officially opened its doors in June of 1824 with a dedication ceremony attended by more than 300 local residents. Reverend Jonathan Hayes of the Millbrook Baptist Church delivered the opening sermon, praising the Whitmores for their selfless commitment to Christian charity. Mayor William Patterson presented them with an official proclamation declaring the refuge a vital community institution worthy of public support. Local newspapers published glowing articles about the facility, describing it as a model for Christian child care that other communities should emulate. The farmhouse had been extensively renovated to accommodate its new purpose. The ground floor contained a large common room where children could play and receive instruction, a dining hall capable of seating 40 people, and separate quarters for the Whitmore family. The second floor housed individual bedrooms for the children, each furnished with simple but comfortable beds, washstands, and storage for personal belongings. The third floor, which would later become the site of unspeakable horrors, was initially described as additional sleeping quarters and storage space for the growing operation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Samuel's fundraising efforts were remarkably successful from the very beginning. He traveled throughout North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, speaking at churches and community gatherings about the desperate need for Christian charity to help abandoned children. His presentations were masterfully crafted emotional appeals that combined heart-wrenching stories of individual children with detailed financial breakdowns showing exactly how donations would be used. He could reduce entire congregations to tears with his accounts of children found starving in city streets or abandoned by families too poor to feed them. The donation system that Samuel established was both sophisticated and psychologically manipulative. Contributors could sponsor individual children for $20 per month, receiving regular letters describing their sponsored child's progress and expressing gratitude for the donor's Christian generosity. Families could make larger contributions to fund special projects like new dormitories, educational programs, or medical care. Churches were encouraged to organize annual collection drives specifically for the Children's Refuge, with the Whitmores providing detailed reports on how these funds were being used to serve God's most vulnerable children. Margaret's role in the operation was equally important, but more subtle. She managed the day-to-day care of the children, handled correspondence with donors, and maintained the detailed records that made the refuge appear to be a model of efficient charitable organization. She wrote hundreds of letters each month, thanking contributors for their generosity and providing updates on the children's welfare. Her writing style was warm and personal, creating emotional connections between donors and the children they believed they were helping. The first child to arrive at the refuge under suspicious circumstances was 8-year-old Mary Catherine Morrison in September of 1824. Mary Catherine had been brought to the Whitmores by her uncle, Robert Morrison, who claimed that his sister had died of consumption and that he could not afford to care for his niece. Robert paid the Whitmores $50 to take permanent custody of the child, signing legal documents that transferred all parental rights to Samuel and Margaret. What Robert Morrison did not know was that Mary Catherine would never be seen outside the Whitmore property again. Within a week of her arrival, she had been moved from the comfortable second-floor bedrooms to a small room in the attic, where she was kept locked away from the other children and visitors. Samuel explained to the other children that Mary Catherine was ill with a contagious condition and needed to be isolated for everyone's safety. Margaret told donors who asked about specific children that some were undergoing special treatments or educational programs that required temporary separation from the main group. The systematic imprisonment of children began gradually and followed a carefully planned pattern. New arrivals would spend their first few weeks living normally with the other children, participating in daily activities and appearing healthy. and happy to visitors. During this period, the Whitmores would evaluate each child's potential value, considering factors like age, physical appearance, family connections, and the likelihood that anyone would come looking for them if they disappeared. Children who were deemed suitable for the special program would gradually be separated from the main group. They would first be moved to different sleeping quarters, supposedly for disciplinary reasons or special educational opportunities. Then, they would stop appearing at mealtimes, with explanations that they were receiving individualized instruction or were being prepared for placement with adoptive families. Finally, they would disappear entirely from the visible operation of the refuge, known only to the Whitmores and their closest accomplices. The construction of the attic prison began in late 1824, disguised as routine improvements to the building's storage capacity. Samuel hired local carpenters to install additional support beams and flooring in the third-floor space, explaining that the refuge needed more room for supplies and equipment. What the workers did not know was that they were actually building the framework for a series of wooden cages that would house stolen children for years. The cages themselves were constructed during the winter months when fewer visitors came to the refuge, and the Whitmores had more privacy to complete their horrific project. Each cage was approximately 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 5 feet high, barely large enough for a child to lie down or stand upright. They were built with sturdy oak planks and secured with heavy iron locks that Samuel had ordered from a blacksmith in Charlotte, claiming they were needed for storage rooms containing valuable supplies. The false wall that concealed the caged children was an engineering marvel of deception. It appeared to be a simple partition separating storage areas, complete with shelves holding supplies and equipment that gave it the appearance of legitimate use. However, the wall could be moved aside to reveal the hidden chamber where the imprisoned children were kept. The space was deliberately designed to muffle sound, with thick wooden walls and heavy fabric hangings that prevented screams or cries from being heard elsewhere in the building. By the spring of 1825, the Whitmores were operating 2 completely separate facilities within the same building. The Visible Children's Refuge continued to house approximately 15 children who lived normal lives, received education and care, and were regularly seen by visitors and donors. The hidden prison contained 7 children who had been systematically removed from the public operation and were being held for purposes that would not become clear until the full investigation was completed years later. The psychological manipulation of the imprisoned children was as systematic as their physical confinement. Samuel and Margaret convinced the caged children that they were being punished for serious sins, and that their imprisonment was necessary for their spiritual salvation. They were told that the outside world had forgotten them, and that the Whitmores were the only people who cared enough to help them overcome their moral failures. Regular religious instruction emphasized themes of obedience, suffering, and redemption through punishment. The children were also told that their families had abandoned them because they were too wicked to deserve love, and that only through complete submission to the Whitmores' authority could they ever hope to earn forgiveness. This psychological abuse was reinforced through a system of rewards and punishments that made the children dependent on their captors for even the smallest comforts. A kind word from Margaret or a slightly larger portion of food from Samuel became precious gifts that the children would do anything to earn. The daily routine for the imprisoned children was designed to break their spirits and ensure complete compliance. They were awakened before dawn for prayer and religious instruction, followed by hours of forced labor that included sewing, cleaning, and food preparation for the Visible Refuge operation. Meals consisted of thin gruel and stale bread, barely sufficient to maintain life but inadequate for healthy growth and development. The children were allowed outside their cages for only a few hours each day, and even then only under close supervision, and with strict orders to remain silent. Medical care for the imprisoned children was virtually non-existent. When children became ill, they were left to recover on their own or die in their cages. Samuel claimed that illness was God's way of testing their faith and that medical intervention would interfere with divine will. Several children died during their imprisonment, and their bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the property, with Samuel telling anyone who asked that they had been placed with adoptive families in distant states. The visible operation of the Children's Refuge continued to flourish during these early years, with donations increasing each year and the Whitmore's reputation growing throughout the region. They were invited to speak at religious conferences and charitable gatherings, where they shared inspiring stories about their work and encouraged others to follow their example of Christian service. Local newspapers regularly published articles praising their efforts and encouraging community support for their mission. The financial success of the operation was staggering. By 1826, the Whitmores were receiving more than $3,000 per month in donations, equivalent to approximately $75,000 in today's currency. They used this money to expand their property, purchase additional buildings, and hire staff members who helped maintain the elaborate deception that concealed their crimes. They also began investing in legitimate businesses and real estate, building wealth that would make them one of the most prosperous families in Millbrook County. The expansion of the hidden prison continued throughout 1826 and 1827, with additional cages being constructed to accommodate the growing number of children who were being systematically removed from the visible operation. By 1828, the attic contained more than 20 cages, each housing a child who had been stolen from families or donors who believed they were supporting Christian charity. The Whitmores had perfected their system of deception and were operating what amounted to a child trafficking operation disguised as a charitable institution. The selection process for determining which children would be imprisoned became increasingly systematic and profitable. The Whitmores began specifically targeting children who met certain criteria that made them valuable for purposes that extended far beyond simple imprisonment. They preferred children between the ages of 6 and 14, with particular emphasis on those who were attractive, intelligent, and came from families with limited means to search for them if they disappeared. The network of accomplices that supported the Whitmore operation grew steadily during these years, eventually including local officials, church leaders, and business associates who profited from their association with the seemingly successful charitable institution. County Sheriff Daniel Brooks received regular payments to ignore suspicious activities at the refuge and to discourage investigation of missing children reports. Judge Harrison Mitchell, who handled legal matters related to child custody and adoption, was paid to process fraudulent documents that gave the Whitmores legal control over children whose families had not actually surrendered them. By 1830, the Millbrook Children's Refuge had become a regional institution with a reputation that extended throughout the southeastern United States. Religious organizations sent delegations to study their methods and implement similar programs in their own communities. Government officials pointed to the refuge as an example of how private charity could address social problems more effectively than public institutions. The Whitmores were invited to advise other charitable organizations and were considered experts in child welfare and Christian education. The horrible irony of this reputation was that it provided perfect cover for crimes that were becoming increasingly bold and systematic. The more respected the Whitmores became, the less likely anyone was to question their methods or investigate reports of missing children. Their success story had become so important to the community's self-image that people actively resisted information that might tarnish their reputation or call into question the charitable work that everyone took pride in supporting. The transformation of the Millbrook Children's Refuge from a legitimate charitable operation into a systematic child trafficking enterprise accelerated dramatically in the summer of 1830. Samuel Whitmore had spent 6 years perfecting his methods. of deception, and building a network of accomplices who enabled his increasingly bold crimes. The refuge now housed 43 children in its visible operation, while concealing 26 imprisoned children in the expanding attic prison system. The breakthrough that allowed Samuel to operate on a much larger scale came through his association with Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, a traveling physician who had been providing medical care to the refuge children since 1829. Dr. Fitzgerald was a man of questionable ethics who had lost his medical license in Virginia after being accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on charity patients. He arrived in Millbrook County seeking a fresh start and found in Samuel Whitmore a partner who shared his willingness to exploit vulnerable populations for personal gain. Dr. Fitzgerald's medical expertise enabled the Whitmores to expand their operation in ways that had previously been impossible. He developed a system for drugging children during the transition from the visible refuge to the hidden prison, using laudanum and other opiates to keep them docile during the traumatic process of imprisonment. He also provided medical justification for the disappearance of children, creating false diagnoses of contagious diseases that required isolation or claims of mental deficiency that necessitated specialized treatment in distant institutions. The doctor's most valuable contribution was his connections to a network of wealthy individuals throughout the South who were willing to pay substantial sums for access to children who could not be traced back to their families. These customers included plantation owners seeking young workers who could be completely controlled, wealthy perverts who paid premium prices for access to attractive children, and medical researchers who wanted subjects for experiments that would have been illegal if conducted on children with legal protections. The financial arrangements for these transactions were sophisticated and carefully designed to avoid detection. Customers paid fees ranging from $200 to over $1,000 per child, depending on age, appearance, and specific requirements. Payments were made through a network of banks and intermediaries that made it nearly impossible to trace the money back to its source. The Whitmores established accounts in Charleston, Richmond, and Atlanta, moving funds regularly to avoid creating patterns that might attract attention from authorities. Margaret Whitmore's role in the operation evolved significantly during this period as she developed expertise in the psychological manipulation techniques necessary to prepare children for their eventual fate. She created elaborate narratives that convinced imprisoned children that their suffering was temporary, and that compliance with the Whitmores' demands would eventually lead to freedom and reunion with loving families. These stories were carefully crafted to maintain hope while ensuring submission, keeping the children cooperative enough to be manageable while preventing them from attempting escape or rebellion. The process of selecting children for imprisonment became increasingly scientific and methodical. Margaret maintained detailed records on every child who entered the refuge, noting physical characteristics, personality traits, family background, and potential market value. Children were observed for weeks or months before decisions were made about their fate, with the Whitmores carefully evaluating factors that would determine their suitability for different types of customers. Children who showed signs of intelligence or leadership were often targeted for early imprisonment because they posed the greatest risk of exposing the operation if they remained in the visible refuge too long. Attractive children, particularly girls between the ages of 8 and 14, commanded the highest prices from customers and were prioritized for the hidden operation. Children with no living relatives or whose families were too poor to mount effective searches were considered ideal candidates because their disappearance was unlikely to trigger serious investigation. The physical expansion of the prison system required constant construction and modification of the farmhouse structure. Samuel hired different contractors for small projects, ensuring that no single person understood the full scope of the modifications being made. He claimed that the constant construction was necessary to accommodate the growing number of children being served by the refuge, and local residents praised his commitment to expanding the facility's capacity to help more needy children. The attic prison system eventually consisted of 37 individual cages, arranged in 3 separate chambers, each accessible through different concealed entrances. The largest chamber contained 24 cages for children between the ages of 6 and 12. A smaller chamber housed 8 cages designed for older children and adolescents. The third chamber contained 5 specially constructed cages that were used for children who required additional security or who were being prepared for immediate transfer to customers. Each chamber was equipped with its own ventilation system, waste disposal arrangements, and security measures that prevented children from communicating with each other or with anyone outside the prison. The chambers were soundproofed using techniques that Samuel had learned from studying prison construction, and the entire system was designed to be virtually undetectable even if someone searched the building systematically. The daily routine for imprisoned children became increasingly regimented and brutal as the operation expanded. Children were awakened at 4 in the morning for 2 hours of forced labor that included manufacturing items that were sold to generate additional revenue for the operation. They spent the middle hours of the day in religious instruction sessions, where they were indoctrinated with beliefs that justified their imprisonment and encouraged submission to authority. Afternoons were devoted to preparation activities that varied depending on each child's eventual destination, including training in domestic work, basic education for children destined for household service, or physical conditioning for those intended for agricultural labor. The food provided to imprisoned children was calculated to maintain life while minimizing costs and ensuring physical weakness that would prevent escape attempts. Breakfast consisted of thin porridge made from cornmeal and water. Lunch was typically bread and water with occasional additions of vegetables that were too damaged to serve to the visible refuge children. Dinner was usually a watery soup made from kitchen scraps and bones. Children who showed signs of defiance or attempted to communicate with others received reduced rations that brought them to the edge of starvation. Medical care for imprisoned children was limited to interventions that maintained their market value or prevented contagious diseases that might spread to the visible refuge population. Dr. Fitzgerald examined the imprisoned children monthly, focusing on identifying and treating conditions that might reduce their value to potential customers. Children who became seriously ill were often killed rather than treated, with their deaths attributed to natural causes or accidents that could not have been prevented. The psychological effects of prolonged imprisonment were devastating and became increasingly apparent as children spent months or years in the attic cages. Younger children often developed severe behavioral problems, including self-harm, refusal to eat, and complete withdrawal from human contact. Older children frequently displayed signs of mental breakdown, including hallucinations, violent outbursts, and attempts at suicide. The Whitmores dealt with these problems through increased use of drugs and physical restraints rather than addressing the underlying causes of the children's distress. The customer base for the Whitmore operation expanded steadily throughout the early 1830s as word of their services spread through networks of wealthy individuals who shared interests in exploiting vulnerable children. Dr. Fitzgerald's connections proved invaluable in reaching potential customers who might never have learned about the operation through conventional channels. These customers included wealthy plantation families seeking reliable domestic workers, factory owners looking for cheap labor that could be completely controlled, and individuals whose interests in children were too dangerous to pursue through legitimate channels. The transportation of children from the refuge to their final destinations required elaborate planning and coordination to avoid detection. Samuel developed relationships with wagon drivers, boat captains, and other transporters who were willing to move human cargo without asking questions about its origin or destination. These transporters were paid premium rates for their discretion and were provided with false documentation that explained the presence of children in their vehicles as legitimate transfers between charitable institutions or placement with adoptive families. The documentation system that supported these transfers was sophisticated and designed to withstand casual scrutiny from authorities who might encounter the transporters during their journeys. Dr. Fitzgerald used his medical credentials to create false health certificates and travel permits. Margaret forged correspondence from fictional adoptive families expressing eagerness to receive their new children. Samuel produced official-looking transfer documents that appeared to authorize the movement of children between legitimate charitable institutions. The profits from the child trafficking operation were enormous and growing rapidly. By 1832, the Whitmores were generating more than $10,000 annually from the sale of imprisoned children. In addition to the $3,000 monthly they continued to receive in charitable donations. This income allowed them to expand their property holdings, invest in legitimate businesses, and maintain the appearance of prosperity that supported their reputation as successful charitable leaders. The reinvestment of trafficking profits into legitimate businesses served multiple purposes beyond simple wealth accumulation. It provided additional cover for their criminal activities by creating plausible explanations for their obvious prosperity. It also generated income that could be documented and reported to authorities if questions arose about the source of their wealth. Most importantly, it created business relationships with respectable community members who had financial incentives to protect the Whitmores' reputation and resist investigation of their activities. By 1833, the Millbrook Children's Refuge had become the most successful charitable institution in North Carolina, with a reputation that extended throughout the southeastern United States and beyond. Religious organizations from as far away as Pennsylvania and Georgia sent representatives to study their methods and learn how to implement similar programs in their own communities. Government officials regularly cited the refuge as an example of how private charity could address social problems more effectively than public institutions. The success of the visible operation provided perfect cover for the systematic expansion of the child trafficking enterprise. The more respected and admired the Whitmores became, the less likely anyone was to question their methods or investigate reports that might call their reputation into doubt. Their charitable work had become so important to the community's identity and self-respect that residents actively resisted information that might tarnish the institution they took such pride in supporting. The network of accomplices and supporters that enabled the Whitmore operation continued to grow throughout this period, eventually including dozens of individuals who profited directly or indirectly from their association with the refuge. Local merchants provided supplies at inflated prices and received kickbacks for their cooperation. Politicians accepted campaign contributions and personal gifts in exchange for favorable treatment and protection from investigation. Even religious leaders who should have been most concerned about the welfare of children became complicit in the operation through their acceptance of generous donations and their willingness to discourage questions about the refuge's methods. The expansion phase of the Whitmore operation reached its peak in 1834, when they were handling more than 100 children annually, with approximately 60% being processed through the hidden trafficking system while 40% remained in the visible charitable operation. The scale and sophistication of their crimes had reached levels that would have been impossible without the extensive network of corruption and complicity that they had built over the previous decade. The summer of 1834 marked the beginning of the most horrific period in the Whitmore operation's 12-year history. Samuel and Margaret had grown so confident in their ability to operate without detection that they began taking increasingly dangerous risks, expanding their criminal enterprise beyond simple child trafficking into areas that would eventually lead to their downfall. The refuge now processed children at an industrial scale, with new arrivals being evaluated and sorted for different purposes within days of their arrival. The catalyst for this escalation was the arrival of Helena Morrison, a wealthy widow from Charleston, whose 15-year-old daughter, Catherine, had been placed at the refuge 6 months earlier. Helena had been paying premium fees for Catherine's care and had been receiving regular letters supposedly written by her daughter describing her happiness and spiritual growth at the facility. However, Helena's unexpected visit to check on Catherine's progress would reveal the first cracks in the elaborate deception that the Whitmores had maintained for over a decade. Catherine Morrison had actually been sold to a tobacco plantation in Georgia within 2 weeks of her arrival at the refuge, but Margaret had continued writing fake letters in Catherine's handwriting to maintain the illusion that she remained at the facility. When Helena demanded to see her daughter immediately, Margaret claimed that Catherine was recovering from a mild fever and could not receive visitors. Helena's insistence on waiting until Catherine recovered forced the Whitmores to implement desperate measures to maintain their deception. Samuel's solution was characteristically ruthless and revealed the depths of depravity that the operation had reached. He decided to murder Helena Morrison and dispose of her body, then forge letters to her Charleston relatives, claiming that she had decided to remain at the refuge as a volunteer worker. This would be the first time the Whitmores had killed an adult to protect their operation, marking a significant escalation in their willingness to commit violence to maintain their criminal enterprise. Helena Morrison's murder took place on the evening of July 23, 1834, in the same methodical manner that had characterized all of the Whitmores' criminal activities. Dr. Fitzgerald administered a lethal dose of laudanum while Samuel and Margaret held Helena down and assured her that she was simply being given medicine to help her rest. Her final moments were spent listening to Margaret's whispered prayers about joining her daughter in heaven, not knowing that Catherine was actually laboring on a distant plantation under conditions that amounted to slavery. The disposal of Helena's body required the construction of new burial facilities on the property, as the existing graves were reserved for children who had died during imprisonment. Samuel designated a remote section of the property as an adult cemetery, telling his staff that it would be used for refuge supporters who wished to be buried on consecrated ground. Helena Morrison became the first occupant of this new burial ground, her grave marked only with a simple wooden cross bearing false dates that would make it appear she had died of natural causes. The success of Helena Morrison's murder convinced Samuel that adult visitors posed the greatest threat to their operation and needed to be handled with extreme prejudice. He developed protocols for identifying potentially dangerous visitors and implemented security measures designed to prevent anyone from leaving the property alive if they discovered evidence of the trafficking operation. These measures included weapons caches hidden throughout the buildings, escape routes for the Whitmore family, and contingency plans for destroying evidence if the operation was threatened with exposure. The expansion of the murder protocol to include adults created new logistical challenges that required additional accomplices and more sophisticated cover-up procedures. Samuel recruited 2 local men, James Caldwell and Robert Nash, who had proven their reliability through previous involvement in transporting trafficked children. Caldwell and Nash were paid generous salaries to serve as full-time security personnel, with their official duties including property maintenance and protection of the children from outside threats. Their actual responsibilities included disposing of bodies, intimidating potential witnesses, and eliminating anyone who posed a threat to the operation. The presence of armed accomplices on the property allowed Samuel to implement increasingly bold expansion plans that had previously been too risky to attempt. He began actively recruiting children from beyond North Carolina, sending agents to Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia to identify suitable targets and arrange for their transportation to the refuge. These recruitment operations were disguised as charitable missions to help children in distant communities, with local churches and officials providing letters of recommendation that gave the agents credibility and access to vulnerable families. The recruitment agents were carefully selected, for their ability to gain trust and identify children who could disappear without triggering serious investigation. They typically posed as representatives of educational or religious institutions seeking bright children for special programs, or as adoption facilitators helping childless families find suitable children to raise. The agents were provided with false credentials and detailed cover stories that explained their presence in various communities as legitimate charitable work. The transportation network that brought recruited children to the refuge became increasingly sophisticated and difficult to trace. Samuel established way-station safe houses throughout the region where children could be held temporarily during their journey to Millbrook County. These safe houses were typically operated by individuals who believed they were supporting legitimate charitable work, making them unknowing accomplices in the trafficking operation while providing additional cover for the children's movements. The psychological preparation of newly recruited children became more systematic and effective as Margaret refined her manipulation techniques through years of experience. She developed specific scripts and procedures for breaking down children's resistance and preparing them for life in the attic prison system. New arrivals were isolated from other children immediately upon arrival and subjected to intensive indoctrination sessions designed to convince them that their families had abandoned them and that the Whitmores were their only source of protection and care. The indoctrination process typically lasted 2 to 3 weeks and combined psychological manipulation with gradual physical deprivation to break down the children's mental resistance. Children were told elaborate stories about their families, selling them to pay debts or giving them away because they were too much trouble to care for. They were shown forged letters supposedly from their parents expressing relief at being rid of them and instructing the Whitmores to use whatever discipline was necessary to control their behavior. The physical conditions in the attic prison system deteriorated significantly during this period as overcrowding became a serious problem. The 37 cages were frequently occupied beyond their intended capacity, with smaller children being forced to share spaces that were barely adequate for single occupants. The sanitation systems that had been marginally adequate for smaller numbers of children became completely overwhelmed, creating health hazards that contributed to increased mortality rates among the imprisoned population. The death rate among imprisoned children increased dramatically during 1834 and 1835. Reaching levels that threatened the operation's profitability and forced the Whitmores to implement new procedures for managing mortality. Dr. Fitzgerald established protocols for identifying children who were likely to die soon and arranging for their sale or disposal before their deaths could impact other imprisoned children or create disposal problems. Children who showed signs of serious illness were often killed immediately to prevent the spread of contagious diseases that might devastate the entire imprisoned population. The expanding mortality rate required the construction of additional burial facilities and more sophisticated body disposal procedures. Samuel designated several remote areas of the property as burial grounds and hired additional workers who believed they were maintaining legitimate cemeteries for children who had died of natural causes while receiving care at the refuge. The workers were told that the high mortality rate was due to the refuge's willingness to accept children who were already seriously ill when other institutions had given up hope for their recovery. The financial profits from the expanded operation were enormous but came with increased risks that required more sophisticated money laundering and investment strategies. Samuel was generating more than $20,000 annually from child trafficking by 1835, in addition to the continuing flow of charitable donations that provided cover for his obvious prosperity. These profits were invested in legitimate businesses throughout the region, creating a network of financial interests that gave Samuel influence over local economic and political developments. The investment strategy served multiple purposes beyond simple wealth accumulation and money laundering. It created relationships with legitimate business leaders who had financial incentives to protect Samuel's reputation and resist investigation of his activities. It also provided employment opportunities for accomplices who needed legitimate sources of income to explain their prosperity and maintain their cover identities. Most importantly, it created multiple income streams that would be difficult for authorities to trace back to criminal activities if the trafficking operation was ever discovered. The corruption network that supported the Whitmore operation expanded significantly during this period as Samuel used his growing wealth and influence to compromise additional officials and community leaders. County Commissioner William Hartley received substantial payments to ensure that county records did not reflect the true number of children being processed through the refuge. State Representative John Morrison accepted generous campaign contributions in exchange for blocking legislative initiatives that might have increased oversight of charitable institutions. The religious support network that had been crucial to the operation's early success became even more important as the scale of criminal activity increased. Reverend Jonathan Hayes continued to provide spiritual endorsement for the refuge's work and actively discouraged members of his congregation from asking detailed questions about the facility's operations. Other local ministers were recruited through a combination of generous donations to their churches and carefully crafted appeals to their desire to support Christian charitable work. The community support that had always been essential to the operation's success reached new levels during this period as Samuel and Margaret became increasingly prominent in local social and political circles. They were invited to major social events, consulted on community development projects, and treated as examples of successful Christian living by their neighbors and associates. This social prominence provided additional protection from investigation and made it even more difficult for potential critics to raise questions about their activities without facing social consequences. The psychological toll of operating such an extensive criminal enterprise was becoming apparent in both Samuel and Margaret by 1835. Although it manifested in different ways that reflected their distinct personalities and roles in the operation, Samuel became increasingly paranoid and controlling, implementing elaborate security procedures and contingency plans that reflected his growing fear of discovery and punishment. He began carrying weapons constantly and insisted that all conversations about sensitive topics take place in secure locations where they could not be overheard. Margaret's psychological deterioration was more subtle but ultimately more dangerous. To the operation's security, she began experiencing what she described as religious visions that provided divine justification for increasingly extreme actions against children and adults who posed threats to the operation. These visions convinced her that she was carrying out God's will by eliminating people who interfered with her sacred mission of caring for abandoned children, and they provided psychological permission for her to participate in murders that she might otherwise have found morally unacceptable. The expansion phase of the Whitmore operation reached its absolute peak in late 1835, when they were processing more than 150 children annually and had accumulated wealth that made them one of the most prosperous families in North Carolina. However, the very success that had enabled their criminal enterprise to flourish was about to attract the attention of someone who would prove far more dangerous than any previous threat they had faced. The beginning of the end for the Whitmore operation came in the form of an unexpected visitor who arrived at the refuge on a cold February morning in 1836. Elizabeth Thornfield was not seeking to place a child or make a donation. She was a former governess from Richmond whose employment with wealthy families had given her extensive experience with children and a keen eye for detecting abuse and neglect. Elizabeth had been hired by the Virginia State Board of Charitable Institutions to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of North Carolina facilities that were receiving children from Virginia families. Elizabeth's credentials were impeccable, and her mission was officially sanctioned, making it impossible for Samuel to refuse her access to the facility without arousing suspicion. Her letter of introduction from the Virginia governor's office indicated that she would be conducting a thorough inspection of all areas of the refuge and interviewing both staff and children to assess the quality of care being provided. This was exactly the type of official scrutiny that Samuel had spent 12 years avoiding through careful corruption of local authorities. The timing of Elizabeth's visit could not have been worse for the Whitmores. The refuge was housing 47 children in its visible operation while concealing 31 imprisoned children in the attic system. The recent expansion of their trafficking network had created logistical pressures that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the illusion of a normal charitable institution. Several of the visible children were showing signs of psychological trauma from witnessing suspicious activities, and the constant construction and modification of buildings had created physical evidence that would be difficult to explain to a trained investigator. Samuel's initial strategy was to overwhelm Elizabeth with hospitality and carefully staged demonstrations of the refuge's supposed excellence. He arranged elaborate tours that focused on the most impressive aspects of the facility while avoiding areas where evidence of criminal activity might be discovered. Margaret prepared detailed presentations about their educational programs and religious instruction methods, supported by carefully selected children who had been coached to provide enthusiastic testimonials about their experiences at the refuge. The strategy failed completely because Elizabeth's professional training had taught her to look beyond surface appearances and identify subtle signs of institutional problems. She immediately noticed that many of the children appeared unusually subdued and fearful, responding to questions with rehearsed answers that suggested extensive coaching. The facility's medical records showed mortality rates that were significantly higher than comparable institutions, and the financial documentation revealed expenditures that were inconsistent with the number of children supposedly being served. Elizabeth's most significant discovery occurred during her third day at the refuge when she noticed architectural inconsistencies in the building's third floor that suggested the presence of concealed spaces. Her experience evaluating institutional facilities had taught her to identify structural modifications that might be used to hide evidence of abuse or neglect. The false walls and hidden chambers that Samuel had constructed so carefully over the years were obvious to someone with Elizabeth's expertise and training. The confrontation that would ultimately expose the Whitmore operation began when Elizabeth demanded access to areas of the building that Samuel claimed were being renovated and were therefore unsafe for visitors. Her insistence on inspecting these spaces, combined with her obvious suspicion about the facility's operations, convinced Samuel that she posed an immediate threat to the entire enterprise. His decision to eliminate this threat would prove to be the fatal mistake that brought down the criminal organization he had spent more than a decade building. Samuel's plan to murder Elizabeth Thornfield was implemented on the evening of February 8, 1836, using the same methods that had been successfully employed against Helena Morrison and other dangerous visitors. Dr. Fitzgerald prepared a lethal dose of laudanum while James Caldwell and Robert Nash positioned themselves to prevent Elizabeth from escaping if the initial murder attempt failed. However, Elizabeth's professional experience had made her suspicious of the Whitmore's motives, and she had taken precautions that would ultimately save her life and expose their crimes. Elizabeth had concealed a small knife in her clothing and had arranged with her supervisor in Richmond to send assistance if she failed to report her progress within specified timeframes. When Dr. Fitzgerald attempted to administer the poisoned medicine, Elizabeth fought back with desperate determination, inflicting serious wounds on both the doctor and Margaret before escaping from the room where they had attempted to kill her. Her screams for help alerted several of the visible children to the violence taking place, creating witnesses who could later testify about what they had observed. The chaos that followed Elizabeth's escape attempt revealed the true nature of the refuge to the children who had been living in the visible operation without understanding the horrors that surrounded them. As Elizabeth ran through the building seeking help, she discovered the concealed entrance to the attic prison system and found herself face to face with 31 caged children whose existence had been completely hidden from the outside world. The sight of these imprisoned children, some barely alive after years of abuse and neglect, provided Elizabeth with irrefutable evidence of the systematic crimes that had been committed at the facility. Elizabeth's discovery of the imprisoned children created an immediate crisis for the Whitmores that required desperate action to prevent complete exposure of their operation. Samuel ordered Caldwell and Nash to kill Elizabeth and dispose of her body, while Margaret began implementing emergency procedures to eliminate evidence and prepare for possible evacuation. However, Elizabeth's escape from the building and her flight toward the nearest town meant that external authorities would soon become involved in investigating activities at the refuge. The 3-hour period between Elizabeth's escape and the arrival of law enforcement at the refuge was marked by frantic efforts to conceal evidence and eliminate witnesses who might testify against the Whitmores. Samuel ordered his accomplices to begin killing the imprisoned children to prevent them from providing testimony about their abuse and imprisonment. This decision reflected the complete moral bankruptcy that characterized Samuel's response to threats, but it also created additional evidence of systematic murder that would ultimately ensure his conviction and execution. Margaret's psychological collapse during this crisis period revealed the extent to which years of criminal activity had destroyed her mental stability. She began ranting about divine visions that commanded her to complete her sacred mission by eliminating all the children before authorities could interfere with God's plan. Her obvious insanity made it impossible for her to participate effectively in concealing evidence, and her increasingly erratic behavior created additional risks for the entire operation. Dr. Fitzgerald's wounds from Elizabeth's knife had become infected and were preventing him from providing medical support for the emergency cover-up efforts. His incapacitation meant that the Whitmores lost access to his expertise in drug administration and body disposal just when they needed it most. The absence of medical supervision during the rushed killing of imprisoned children resulted in botched murders that left several children alive but severely injured, creating additional evidence of systematic abuse that would be discovered by investigating authorities. The arrival of Sheriff Thomas Hartwell and a team of deputies at the refuge on the morning of February 9th marked the beginning of the most intensive criminal investigation in North Carolina history. Elizabeth Thornfield's detailed report of her experiences at the facility, combined with her discovery of the imprisoned children, provided authorities with specific locations to search and clear evidence of systematic criminal activity. The sheriff's team was accompanied by medical personnel and representatives from the state government, who were prepared to handle the complex legal and logistical challenges posed by such a large-scale criminal operation. The initial search of the refuge buildings revealed evidence that exceeded even Elizabeth Thornfield's horrific accounts of what she had discovered. The attic prison system contained clear signs of systematic torture and murder, with bloodstains, restraining devices, and medical equipment that had obviously been used for inflicting pain rather than providing care. The discovery of detailed records documenting the sale and transfer of children provided authorities with evidence of an extensive trafficking network that had operated for more than a decade. The interrogation of Samuel and Margaret Whitmore began immediately after their arrest and revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise. Samuel initially attempted to deny involvement in any illegal activities, claiming that the imprisoned children were being held for their own protection because they suffered from contagious diseases or dangerous mental conditions. However, the physical evidence contradicted his explanations, and the testimony of surviving children provided detailed accounts of systematic abuse and murder that made continued denial impossible. Margaret's interrogation was complicated by Her obvious mental instability and her continued insistence that she had been carrying out divine commands to help children achieve salvation through suffering. Her detailed journals, discovered during the search of the refuge, provided investigators with comprehensive documentation of the psychological justification she had developed for participating in systematic child abuse and murder. These journals would later become crucial evidence in establishing the premeditated nature of the crimes and the extensive planning that had been required to carry them out. The investigation of the Whitmore operation's financial records revealed the enormous profits that had been generated through child trafficking and the sophisticated money laundering system that had been used to conceal these earnings. Bank records from multiple states showed regular large deposits that corresponded to known child sales, while business investments and property purchases demonstrated how criminal profits had been converted into legitimate wealth. The financial investigation would eventually lead to the recovery of substantial assets that could be used to compensate victims and support the prosecution of accomplices. The network of corruption that had enabled the Whitmore operation to function for more than a decade began unraveling as investigators followed financial trails and interviewed individuals who had been compromised through bribes or intimidation. Sheriff Daniel Brooks, Judge Harrison Mitchell, and dozens of other officials were arrested as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The investigation revealed that the Whitmore operation had corrupted virtually every level of local government and many state officials, creating a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the refuge. The rescue and medical treatment of the surviving imprisoned children presented authorities with unprecedented challenges in both logistics and medical care. Many of the children had suffered severe physical and psychological trauma that required specialized treatment unavailable in rural North Carolina. The state government arranged for the children to be transported to medical facilities in larger cities where they could receive appropriate care, while also beginning the complex process of identifying the children and locating surviving family members who might be able to provide care. The public reaction to the discovery of the Whitmore crimes was immediate and intense, with newspapers throughout the United States publishing detailed accounts of the systematic abuse and murder that had been disguised as Christian charity. The case challenged fundamental assumptions about the trustworthiness of religious institutions and charitable organizations, leading to demands for increased oversight and regulation of facilities that served vulnerable populations. The scandal also exposed the extent to which local corruption had enabled systematic criminal activity to continue undetected for more than a decade. The trial of Samuel and Margaret Whitmore began in Raleigh on September 14, 1836, drawing crowds from across North Carolina and beyond, who sought to witness justice for what newspapers had dubbed the most heinous crimes ever committed on American soil. The prosecution, led by State Attorney General Marcus Webb, faced the unprecedented challenge of presenting evidence of systematic child trafficking and murder that spanned more than 12 years and involved dozens of accomplices throughout the southeastern states. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, journalists, and family members of victims who had traveled hundreds of miles to see the Whitmores face judgment for their crimes. The physical evidence presented was overwhelming and horrifying. Investigators displayed the metal identification plates that had marked each caged child, the restraining devices used to control imprisoned children, and detailed financial records documenting the sale of human beings. The prosecution's methodical presentation of evidence created a comprehensive picture of criminal enterprise that shocked even experienced legal professionals. The testimony of Elizabeth Thornfield proved to be the most compelling evidence against the defendants. Her detailed account of discovering the imprisoned children, combined with her professional credentials and obvious credibility, provided the jury with an authoritative witness whose testimony could not be challenged or dismissed. Elizabeth's description of the conditions she found in the attic prison system, delivered with the clinical precision of her professional training, left Spectators in stunned silence, and several jury members visibly shaken. The surviving children who testified provided heart-wrenching accounts of their experiences that demonstrated the psychological as well as physical brutality of their treatment. 10-year-old Sarah Mitchell described years of imprisonment in a cage barely large enough for her small body, while 14-year-old Thomas Crawford recounted watching other children die from neglect and abuse. Their testimony was frequently interrupted by emotional outbursts from spectators, and several potential witnesses were deemed too traumatized to testify without risking further psychological damage. Samuel Whitmore's defense strategy focused on portraying him as a man whose charitable intentions had been corrupted by mental illness and religious fanaticism. His attorneys argued that his genuine desire to help orphan children had gradually deteriorated into delusion and criminal behavior that he was unable to control or understand. However, the detailed financial records and systematic nature of the operation made it impossible to sustain claims of insanity or diminished responsibility. Margaret Whitmore's obvious mental breakdown during the trial created different challenges for her defense team. Her constant mutterings about divine visions and religious missions, combined with her apparent inability to understand the charges against her, led to psychiatric evaluation that confirmed severe mental illness. However, the prosecution successfully argued that her detailed journals demonstrated clear awareness of her actions and their criminal nature, regardless of her religious justifications. The trial revealed the full extent of the corruption network that had enabled the Whitmore operation to function undetected for so long. Sheriff Daniel Brooks, Judge Harrison Mitchell, and more than 20 other officials were convicted of conspiracy and corruption charges in separate proceedings that continued for months after the main trial concluded. The systematic nature of the corruption shocked the public and led to comprehensive reforms in local government oversight and accountability. Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald died in custody before the trial began, succumbing to infections from wounds inflicted during Elizabeth Thornfield's escape attempt. His death deprived prosecutors of a key witness but also eliminated someone whose testimony might have provided additional details about the medical aspects of the abuse inflicted on imprisoned children. His personal papers, discovered during the investigation, revealed the extent of his involvement in other criminal activities throughout the region. The verdict was delivered on November 3, 1836, after less than 2 hours of jury deliberation. Samuel Whitmore was found guilty on 87 counts of murder, 43 counts of kidnapping, and numerous charges related to fraud and conspiracy. Margaret Whitmore was found guilty on the same charges, though the jury recommended mercy due to her obvious mental illness. Both defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, with executions scheduled for December 15, 1836. The executions drew enormous crowds to Raleigh, with estimates suggesting that more than 5,000 people gathered to witness what many viewed as essential justice for crimes that had shocked the entire nation. Samuel Whitmore maintained his innocence until the end, delivering a final statement claiming that history would vindicate his charitable work and expose the conspiracy that had falsely accused him. Margaret Whitmore appeared to be completely disconnected from reality, speaking constantly to invisible presences she claimed were the spirits of children she had helped achieve salvation. The aftermath of the Whitmore case extended far beyond the punishment of the primary perpetrators. The investigation led to comprehensive reforms in the regulation and oversight of charitable institutions throughout the United States. State governments implemented mandatory inspection procedures, standardized record-keeping requirements, and background check systems designed to prevent similar abuse from occurring in other facilities. The surviving children faced long and difficult recoveries from years of physical and psychological trauma. The state of North Carolina established special funds to provide medical care and education for the survivors, while also attempting to locate family members who might be able to provide homes for children who could be successfully reunited with relatives. Several children were never successfully identified due to the destruction of records, and they were placed with carefully screened adoptive families who were trained to help them recover from their experiences. The Whitmore property was seized by the state and eventually destroyed, with the buildings being burned to eliminate physical reminders of the horrors that had occurred there. The land was sold to pay restitution to victims' families and support the ongoing care of survivors. Local residents reported that the site remained cursed, with strange sounds and apparitions being observed for years after the buildings were destroyed. The financial investigation led to the recovery of more than $50,000 in assets that had been accumulated through the trafficking operation. These funds were distributed to victims' families and used to support institutions that provided legitimate care for orphaned and abandoned children. The recovery process took several years to complete due to the complexity of tracing assets that had been laundered through multiple businesses and investments. The case established important legal precedents for prosecuting systematic abuse and exploitation of vulnerable populations. The successful conviction of the Whitmores and their accomplices demonstrated that crimes committed under the guise of charitable or religious work would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. These precedents influenced legislation and law enforcement procedures for decades to come. The psychological impact of the Whitmore case on American society was profound and lasting. The revelation that respected community leaders could systematically abuse and murder children while maintaining facades of Christian charity challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and authority. The case contributed to increased skepticism about religious and charitable institutions and greater awareness of the need for independent oversight of facilities serving vulnerable populations. The final entry in the official case files, written by State Attorney General Marcus Webb, captured the lasting significance of the investigation. He noted that the Whitmore case represented not just individual criminal behavior, but a failure of societal institutions to protect the most vulnerable members of the community. The crimes had been enabled by corruption, complacency, and the unwillingness of good people to question authority when presented with evidence of wrongdoing. Today, the site of the former Millbrook Children's Refuge remains empty farmland, with no markers indicating the location where 31 children were found caged in an attic and dozens more lost their lives to systematic abuse and murder. The official records remain sealed in the North Carolina State Archives, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest. The story serves as a permanent reminder that evil can flourish when good people fail to ask difficult questions and hold trusted institutions accountable for their actions. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.